Welcome everybody. So welcome to our lunchtime talk today. It's called Musical Ties, Mapping Handel's Networks. And it's about the importance of who you knew in 18th century London as a musician. So it's going to be presented by Lizzy Buckle. She's a PhD student with us at the Foundling Museum and at Royal Holloway. And she's researching the musical networks involved in running charity benefit concerts in 18th century London. Lizzy's talk is alongside a display that we have on in the museum at the moment, curated by Lizzy, called Friends with Benefits. And that's going to be on with us until the 1st of May. So if you do get a chance, do drop in. We've also got a classical concert on in the museum this Sunday, which you might enjoy if you're interested in classical music. Lizzy, I'm going to let you start.
Okay, hello, thank you for the introduction. So as Kathleen mentioned, my talk is called Musical Ties, and it's all about the interconnections, the musical networks that existed in Georgian London, sort of actually slightly just after Handel's time. So more people, there were still people that he knew, but they were, I suppose, the next generation down. But we're starting with Handel because, if I can just move on to the next slide, here we go. Today would have been Handel's 337th birthday. So yeah, his birthday is on the 23rd of February. And as you probably know, he is and was at the time actually one of the most celebrated composers of the 18th century. And he used his reputation to support several charitable causes, and you can see that from his will. And so in the top bit here, it says, I, George Friedrich Handel, and it says that he gave the governors and trustees of the Society for the Support of Decayed Musicians, which is a charity that was set up to help musicians and their families if they fell on hard times. And it's actually now it still exists. It's the Royal Society of Musicians, if any of you have heard of it. And he gave this particular charity £1,000, which is the equivalent of over £100,000 today. So it's a really extraordinary sum of money. He also left a fair copy of the score and all the parts of his oratorio, The Messiah, to the Foundling Hospital. And this gift enabled the hospital to continue holding annual performances of his oratorio, Messiah, in support of the hospital. These concerts were initially instigated by Handel in 1749, and they continued until 1777. But by the time Handel wrote this will, or certainly when he died, the concerts had already raised £700,000, more than £700,000, or the equivalent of that, for the hospital. So basically, he gave a lot of money and the means for charities to make money in his will, and he did other stuff in his life. But it turns out that these gifts, and in particular these charity concerts that he enabled, are also gifts, if somewhat nerdy ones, for historians and musicologists like me. Preserved in the Foundling Hospital minute books are lists of all the musicians that played in these annual performances of Messiah at the Foundling Hospital. And here's just one of them. And they might look and realistically sound quite boring, but I'm going to show you that these documents provide a fascinating insight into the logistics of how to organise a concert in 18th century London. And they also offer a gateway into the lives of 18th century musicians, just like Handel and his colleagues. So while Handel munches his cake and blows out all 337 candles, let's dive into the interconnected world of the Georgian music industry. So as I mentioned just now, the Messiah was performed every year at the Foundling Hospital until 1777. And this particular performer list comes from 1773. And the concert was held on the 6th of April that year. And as you might expect, it mainly consists of a list of musicians who performed that year, and also how much they were paid. So you can see here that there are the violinists, they're listed here, and then tenors, that's the viola players, there are only 4 of them, and then cellos, bassoons, oboes, so like oboes, horns, trumpets, double basses, countertenors, so that's the chorus, and the chorus members are listed all the way down to here, and then you have the soloists, the principal singers listed here. And it also says how much they were paid. So mostly people got about 15 shillings, but some got slightly more. So you can see that Mr. Reeve, the violinist here, got a guinea, which is £1 and 1 shilling. And the poor viola players, things haven't really changed for them since the 18th century, unfortunately, and they got less. So they got 10 shillings and sixpence, which is half a guinea. These lists also tell us about some of the more practical sides of organising a concert. So, and this also gives us a sense of non-musical people involved, and how they were connected. So if we zoom in on this section here, you can see that it provides information about the tickets to start with. So Mr. Jones provided the tickets, and he was paid £3 and 6 shillings for that, for printing 1,200 tickets, and also for the paper. And this is one of the tickets that, or it's probably one of the tickets, one of those 1,200 printed. I say probably because only certain information was printed on the tickets. They left gaps so you could fill in information about that specific event. So it might be that this ticket was left over from the previous year, and they could have just used that because they just fill in the new information for that year. But it tells you where the concert's going to take place. So at the hospital, the maintenance and education of exposed and deserted young children, that's the posh name, the longer name for the Foundling Hospital. It says where it is, Lambs Conduit Fields, when it's going to happen. And it also tells you a little bit of information about who was taking part. So the vocal parts by Miss Lynley and others. And there's a concerto on the organ by Mr. Stanley, who was quite closely associated with Handel, as it happens. The payment lists also tell us about the advertising. So we can see they paid £4 and 16 shillings for advertisements. And here is one of them on the left-hand side here. This is from, this is in the newspaper in the Morning Chronicle on the 5th of April, so the day before the concert. And it gives very similar information to what we've seen on the ticket. We've got the Lynleys mentioned again, Mr. Stanley says where it's happening. But in addition to the information we saw on the ticket, it says where you can buy the tickets. So I guess where the box office was, I suppose. So you could either get them from the hospital, from a steward there, or you could get them from a coffee shop or a chocolate house. And these are listed below. I have to say my favourite thing about this snapshot from a newspaper isn't the Foundling Hospital advert. It's the one next to it, which was placed by a cheese broker, which I think was quite funny. And I just wonder how many potential attendees at the Foundling Hospital were swayed by this advert for this cheese tasting, which was taking place at 11 o'clock, because I don't think there would have been time to attend the cheese tasting and then dash all the way up to the Foundling Hospital and be there by 12 o'clock. So maybe all the people that were passionate about cheese didn't quite get to see the oratorio that year. Anyway, but sticking with a foodie theme, the performer list also provides information about some beef and wine. And we can zoom in and see it a bit here. And this food and drink was probably for volunteer chorus members who bolstered the paid chorus singers. So they were volunteers, they quite literally sang for their supper. And we don't know an awful lot about them. We don't really know who they were. They might have been pupils of other musicians. We're not quite sure, but I like to think of it as being a really early version of the Scratch Messiah events that maybe you've taken part in, certainly pre-COVID. Perhaps it started in the 18th century. I think it's also a really good reminder that most of the musicians that I'm going to talk about today are actually, I suppose, unusual. They are prominent enough to feature in payment lists, in newspaper adverts, programs, so that we can collect information about them, that we know they existed, we know what their names were and information about them. There were probably lots and lots of other musicians that we just don't know anything about. They're these sort of shadows in history. And that doesn't mean to say they didn't do interesting things, it's just that we don't know about them. And I think it's really important to bear that in mind when we're focusing on people like Handel. So we've started to get a gist of the logistics about the governors, the printers, newspaper publishers, butchers and wine merchants involved in this concert. There was also the High Constable, Mr. Clay here, who was a kind of bouncer, who was, I suppose, on the door, making sure nothing was amiss. But what about the musical networks? Well, I'm going to take you on a very brief tour of, I guess, one branch of a musical network, starting with this payment list. So we're going to start with the Lynley family, who we've kind of heard of a little bit already. So Mr. Lynley, so that's Thomas Lynley Sr., he was the concert manager for this concert. So he's sort of in charge of probably hiring the musicians, finding them. And so he's mentioned here at the top. And his son, Thomas Lynley Jr., was a violinist, as you can see here, and his two daughters, Miss Lynley, so that's Elizabeth Lynley, and his other daughter, Mary Lynley, also performed in that event. Now, Thomas Lynley Jr., he actually had a benefit concert 6 days after the concert at the Foundling Hospital. And so this is the advert for it here. And so this concert wasn't charitable. This was Thomas Lynley Jr. earning some money for himself. And what's interesting is it tells us where he lived at the time. So we look to the information at the bottom here, which I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, you probably can now. It says where you can, it's just in here, you can see where you get the tickets from. And so like in the other one, you can get them from various coffee shops, but you can also get them from Mr. Lynley himself at Mr. Storace's High Street, Marylebone. So we know that he was living with a Mr. Storace, who was also a musician. He was a double bassist, and he actually also played at the Foundling Hospital at least once. So there's a musical connection there. His sisters also sang in this concert. So this is Elizabeth Lynley here, and her sister Mary Lynley, who were also at the Foundling Hospital in 1773 and also mentioned in the ticket. But Elizabeth, in the blue dress here, was to be Miss Elizabeth Lynley no longer. The day after this benefit concert for her brother, she got married to Richard Sheridan, who's this chap here peeping out from behind the curtain at Drury Lane. And he was a playwright and later a politician. So they, as it was announced in the newspaper that they had got married, we're here this day, Mr. Sheridan, student of law, he was at the time, it didn't last very long, married to the celebrated Miss Lynley. Now their courtship was quite complicated, so I'll summarize it very briefly, but this was actually the second time they'd got married. So the first time it hadn't counted because it was supposedly, they got married in Calais and it was a Catholic wedding, which apparently didn't count. So before that, Elizabeth had been a very celebrated, famous soprano in London. It says here even the celebrated Miss Lynley, and she'd had lots of admirers because she was very beautiful and eligible. And she'd got a bit fed up of all these admirers chasing her all the time. And so she decided to become a nun. And so she ran away to France with the aim of joining a convent. But Richard, who obviously had his eye on her, managed to persuade her to let him accompany her as a sort of guardian to, I don't know, protect her. And while they were traveling to France, he persuaded her to get married. And they did, Great. They came back to London, and unfortunately some of the admirers, Elizabeth's admirers, found out about Richard and they weren't very happy. And so he fought several duels for Elizabeth's, to maintain Elizabeth's hand. Did that. Elizabeth's dad wasn't a massive fan of him, managed to get over that, finally brought him round, and eventually they did get married for the second time. So this marriage was quite a lot in the making and was all over the press. Loads of people would have known about it. It sort of almost reminds me of the press stories you see plastered over the Sun. It was that kind of, I don't know, that kind of thing. Anyway, once they got married for the second time, they went on a honeymoon. And when they came back from their honeymoon, they went to stay with their friends who were the Storaces. So evidently there was a connection with the Lynleys and the Storaces. It wasn't just her brother, Thomas Lynley, that was friends with them. It seems they all were. So there's obviously quite a close connection. Now, Thomas Pinto on the left here and Charlotte Brent, who's this one here, they were also friends with the Storaces because when they got married in 1766, Stefano, the double bassist I mentioned before, Stefano Storace was one of the witnesses at their wedding. So they evidently had this mutual set of mutual friends, the Lynleys and the Pintos. And Thomas and Charlotte were also musicians. Thomas was a violinist, although he doesn't seem to have had a really good reputation. In this 19th century dictionary, he is described as very idle, inclining more to the fine gentleman than the musical student. He kept a horse, was always with a switch in his hand instead of a fiddlestick. But despite this reputation, he seems to have performed fairly frequently, and he was also a teacher. And one of his pupils was John Coles, who was at the Foundling Hospital in 1773. There he is, quite far down the violin list. So I don't know if it's sort of probably partly hierarchical. So it seems like he wasn't doing really well at this point, but there he is, paid 15 shillings. And John Coles, a few years later, decided to join the Society Fund for Decayed Musicians that Handel donated to in his will. And in order to do that, you had to have another member recommend you so that they knew that you were, I suppose, worthy of a place. And the person that recommended him was John Park, the oboist, who also played in 1773. So we don't know, maybe they'd known each other before for longer, maybe they met here, but it's nice to see this connection across the parts. Anyway, if we go back to the Pintos again, so Thomas was a violinist, Charlotte was a soprano, and in this picture here, she's arm in arm with John Beard, who's this chap here, who is a very famous tenor. And they appeared in 1760 in an opera called Thomas and Sally, playing Thomas and Sally, surprisingly enough. And the music for this was composed by a Mr. Thomas Arne, who actually, he wrote Rule Britannia, that's sung at the proms. Rule Britannia, Britannia rules the ways. That's Thomas Arne. That's sort of all he's, I guess, renowned for now, but he was quite a famous composer at the time. And Thomas Arne and Charlotte Brent, before Charlotte Brent became Charlotte Pinto when she married Thomas Pinto, had a bit of an affair. Quite a long affair, in fact. At the time, Thomas Arne, here he is, actually that's Rule Britannia there on the organ, he was actually married to a different soprano called Cecilia. But Charlotte Brent was his pupil. And in 1755, they had gone to Dublin, presumably just as pupil and teacher, and they'd gone to Dublin with Thomas's wife as well, Cecilia. But while they were there, Cecilia had become ill and she couldn't perform anymore. So Thomas stopped performing for her because she wasn't, stopped composing for her because there wasn't any point, because she wasn't singing anymore. And so instead, he began composing for Charlotte. And when it was time to leave Dublin, Thomas and Charlotte left together and left Cecilia behind, which suggested that there was something a little bit fishy going on. And if we look at the insurance records from around this time, they also give a flavour of this affair that was going on. So this one is from 1765. So at this point, Charlotte and Thomas had travelled home from Dublin together, left Cecilia behind with some of her relatives. And then after, I think it was about 7 years in Dublin, quite a long time, Cecilia also returned to London. And here she is living at Mr. Goldstone's, a carpenter opposite Coventry Street in the Haymarket, which is a bit odd because Mr. Goldstone isn't her husband, and it makes you wonder what's Thomas up to at this point. Well, a few weeks later, 6 weeks later, this is Thomas's insurance record, and you can see that directly underneath his entry in the register is Charlotte Eloisa Brent. Charlotte Brent we've heard from before, and if we zoom in, you can see that she was living at Dr. Arne's in Covent Garden Piazza. And she is a spinster. So they're not married. She's still got her maiden name. The fact that her record came directly below his suggests they went to the insurer's office together. Very much smells of some kind of an affair going on. So poor Cecilia. But 1 year later, Charlotte Brent upped and married Thomas Pinto. We don't know what caused their Charlotte and Thomas Arne's relationship to break down, but Thomas Arne was very bitter about it, it seems. Apparently when he found out about Charlotte's marriage to Thomas Pinto, he refused to discuss her ever again and declared, "Pray don't name her, she has married a fiddler," because it's evidently a terrible thing to do. But what happened to Cecilia? Well, the next insurance record we have for her is from 6 years later, and she's still not living with Thomas Arne. She now lives with a musician, says here musician, called Mr. Bartellemann in Dean Street, Soho. Now this almost certainly is not another affair going on here. Mr. Bartellemann is actually François Hippolyte Bartellemann, who was the husband of Cecilia, who she is, Cecilia's niece, Polly. So when they'd been in Dublin, Cecilia had gone with her niece, Polly, and it seems like they had quite a close relationship. You can see that Polly's daughter is also called Cecilia, and it's nice to think that perhaps she named her daughter after her aunt. And Polly seems to also, well, she definitely was a successful singer in her own right, but she did have some problems later on in her life. On the 2nd of November 1784, this notice appeared in the newspaper, the Morning Post and Daily Advertiser, and it was reputedly written by Polly herself. And she describes herself here as an English woman of unblemished reputation. And she goes on to demand to know why theatre managers keep rejecting her offers to perform. And she over-eggs it really. She talks about her esteemed career. She says she's received the most flattering reception from the Pope and the Queen of France. And yet, despite this excellent reputation, impresarios don't want her. They say that she's not provoking enough interest. People aren't buying tickets, so they don't want her. So it really does smell of desperation, and it's a bit unsurprising maybe that her career doesn't seem to have taken off after this point, which is a little bit sad. Anyway, but Polly was part of quite a large musical family, the Young family. So it wasn't just Cecilia and her that were sopranos. Cecilia's sister, Isabella, was a soprano. Her other sister was an alto. Polly's sister, Isabella, was a very famous soprano, and her other sister, Elizabeth, was an alto who was married to a violinist called Ridley Dorman, who, as it happens, also performed at the Foundling Hospital in 1773. There he is, slightly a few rungs ahead of John Coles. And Polly also married, like her sister, married a violinist, François Hippolyte, which was where Cecilia was staying at in the insurance record we saw there. And we've actually got a picture of François Hippolyte. He's in this picture of Vauxhall Gardens by Thomas Rowlandson from 1784. So Vauxhall Gardens was a pleasure garden where, if you've seen Bridgerton, it's there's one particular scene where they're outside and there are loads of fireworks going on, and that is very loosely, I should say, based on Vauxhall Gardens. And here they've got there's a sort of concert going on, and the musicians are all up here, and then below them here are spectators, people are having a bit of a chat, they're listening to the music. And some musicologists or historians have been able to identify some of the musicians that are depicted here. So if we zoom in, we know this is François Hippolyte here leading on the violin. He's behind Frederica Weissel, who's a soprano singing at the front here. This oboist is Johann Christian Fischer, and behind him is Jacob Nielsen, who's playing the kettle drums. In 1784, when this image was created, Frederica, who she is, lived with her husband, Karl Weissel, who was he's an oboist, although not in this picture. And they lived at number 3 Church Street, just south of Soho Square. So just there on the map. And they live next door to Thomas Rowlandson, the artist. He rented an apartment at number 4 Church Street, which you might be thinking, aha, what a coincidence. Well, Frederica's connection to Rowlandson, and also the fact that she's right bang in the centre of the picture, have led some to suggest that this work had been commissioned by Frederica from her next door neighbour, or maybe Rowlandson presented the picture to Frederica as a retirement gift, because I think she retired the following year. But either way, we know that this picture did not represent an accurate image of a performance. There are lots of anachronisms that mean that there are people shown at the bottom here who can't possibly have known each other, or even being painted in the age that they are shown, if that makes sense, at this time. So it's very much a hypothetical ensemble. And so we can't look at the musicians being shown here and know that they definitely knew each other just from the picture alone. But there is other evidence that suggests that actually the musicians, the 4 that I've highlighted, did know each other. So Fischer and Weissel, so at the top here, they both performed together several times at Covent Garden, so they probably knew each other. And Fischer and Frederica's husband Weissel, because they were both oboists, the chances are they probably knew of each other as, rivals, or passed on each other's names where necessary. Nielsen, playing the kettle drums, had been associated with Vauxhall Gardens for a really long time. When he died a few years later, he'd been playing there for something like 50 years. And Weissel had been a star there for over 20. So those two must also have known each other. And all 4 musicians had performed at different times at the Foundling Hospital. Nielsen was quite a regular performer. I think he performed in nearly every single year that the Messiah performance took place. And in 1769, he played with Karl Weissel, 1770 with Fischer and also Weissel again, and then in 1771 and 1772 with Frederica, who was one of the soloists. And in 1773, he also played, and actually, if you zoom in, there he is. He's down as Nelson. It's a bit unclear whether he's Nielsen or Nelson. It seems to be a mixture of the two. And he's obviously a fairly respected performer because he's paid a guinea, rather than, for example, what the the viola players received. And the eagle-eyed among you might have spotted this earlier, but Johann Christian Fischer was actually at Thomas Lynley Jr.'s benefit concert the day after the Foundling Hospital concert in 1773. There he is. So we've sort of come full circles. We started with the concert at the Foundling Hospital and moved on to this, and we're back to where we started. And now the purpose of my very brief and possibly slightly mind-boggling romp through 18th century musical networks was to demonstrate just how interconnected the musical world was. You really get the sense that everyone knew everyone, or at least that there must have been an awful lot of mutual friends between all these performers. But why was that the case? Well, firstly, if you were born into a musical family, or into the musical world at least, it's kind of unsurprising that your friends, your spouse would have been musicians, because they're the people that you spend time with. You probably have things in common. So that part isn't particularly surprising. But there are lots of benefits to having these close connections within the musical world. We've seen 3 musical families, and there were lots more just in this talk. There were the Lynleys, the Storaces, and the Youngs. And there were lots of benefits from being a member of one of these really prominent families. So firstly, there's practical support. Older family members could help younger members to make professional contacts. They could introduce each other. They can recommend their son or daughter. We saw in the payment list that Mr. Lynley Sr. had brought along his children to play at this concert. So it's really handy to get as a way into performance. And these older members could also teach practical skills. They could teach the younger members how to compose, or how to play instruments, or how to sing, and they could also lend them instruments, and they weren't cheap, so it again helped them get their foot in the door. In fact, John Park, who I mentioned earlier, he was the one that recommended the violinist John Coles to the Royal Society of Musicians. John Park had a brother called William, who's quite a few years younger, and he taught him how to play the oboe, and they were both very successful oboists in their own, but in slightly different periods, because William was a bit younger. And there are lots of instances where certain families or siblings are well known for playing a certain instrument, which makes it very hard, because sometimes you can't work out which one is actually playing at a certain concert. But basically, there's a lot of skills and know-how that could be disseminated in these tight family groups. Another benefit of having a good musical network was job security. Like today, musicians often had portfolio careers, so they held down several jobs at once at different institutions. And the work was also seasonal. Lots of people flocked to London during the social season, which is when the parliaments were in session. But once that was over, usually in the summer, they went back to their country houses. So musicians had to ensure that they earned enough money during the season to sustain them through the sort of the harder months. And there weren't open auditions like you might get for orchestras today. It seems to have been based on word of mouth, whether you knew a fixer, whether you knew somebody that was looking for musicians at a particular venue. And so again, it really helped if you could build up a network of musicians that were associated with lots of different institutions, so that they might recommend you for the next concert, for the next benefit concert or series or something like that. So it very much helped with making sure that you had a regular income. And thirdly, networks were also crucial if things went wrong. Unless a musician worked for the court or the church, they didn't really get a pension, and there was no sick pay or health insurance or anything like that. So when you got older, or if you were ill or something, there wasn't anything to back you up. The closest that you could get to that was to become a member of the Royal Society of Musicians, this charity that Handel supported in his will. But as we saw earlier, in order to become a member, you had to be recommended by another member, which required you being in the know, knowing the right people. And actually, if you fell down the stairs, broke your leg and couldn't play the organ or whatever, and wanted to make a claim to the society, you had to get 10 members of the society to vouch for you, to say that you were a proper musician, but you were definitely in need, which is a lot of people, and a lot of people that you not only have to know, but they have to support you and I guess want to help you. And then in order to become a member of the society in the first place, you had to be able to afford the subscription fee, which was paid annually, which meant that you needed to have a steady income. And we just talked about the fact that if you want to have a steady income as a musician, you needed to have lots of networks so that you could have a steady stream of jobs lined up. So it really was a crucial part of what it was to be a musician, a successful musician at this time. So if we return to our birthday boy, he's evidently finished his cake. I referred to him at the start as a composer and philanthropist, but he, like all the other musicians I've mentioned today, was also an entrepreneur. But I think this side of him and lots of other composers and musicians throughout history is often forgotten. We think of famous composers like Handel and Mozart and Beethoven as being driven purely by their love of music and succeeding thanks entirely to their ability to string notes together in a way that we find appealing. But part of their success and the fact that we know it's Handel's birthday today and that we're here celebrating it in the first place was down to the fact that they developed these musical networks, that their name had appeared in all these different places. So it was all about not just what you knew, but also who you knew. And so that really just leaves me with time to slightly plug my exhibition again, which is all about these kind of networks. It's called Friends with Benefits. It's sort of a play on words with benefit concerts like the one that Thomas Lynley organised. And it would be really lovely to see some of you there. Although I guess if you live in Helsinki, that's quite a long way to come. That would be dedication. Thank you.
Could I just say thank you very much indeed, Lizzy? That was really fascinating. It's great to have the opportunity to explore more about Handel, who was such an important part of the Foundling Hospital story. So that was really excellent. Thank you. If people have questions, would they like to pop them into the Q&A or into the chat? Either is fine. But it'd be lovely to hear from you if you have questions for Lizzy. And I will start with one. Yeah, I'm just intrigued about how they were paid. So were they paid, because the Foundling Hospital, you see that they get a sort of set fee.
Yeah.
But I think sometimes they got a sort of cut of the takings. How did that work?
Well, I think it depends partly on what institution. So mainly, for example, at the Foundling Hospital and also at probably Covent Garden and things like that, they were given a set fee, and that was what they got. It was irrespective of the amount that the concert or the particular concert series, I suppose, made in takings. But benefit concerts, which I've mentioned a few times, they were organised either in aid of a charity, like in the case of the Foundling Hospital, or in the case of Thomas Lynley Jr., they were organised purely by the musicians themselves, which meant that all of the expenses were on them. So they had to hire the venue and the music and the performers, which meant that they could also take home all of the takings as well. But obviously, if you had a really successful concert, great, you'd make lots of money. It was all yours to take home. You didn't lose out to the concert manager or anything like that. But there are also cases where it wasn't very successful and they end up out of pocket because they didn't sell enough tickets. They weren't a popular enough musician. So it was always a bit of a risk. So yeah, it depends. Some worked one way and some worked the other way.
So I've got a question in here, which is there a catalogue or a booklet to accompany your exhibition or talk?
Oh yes, there is, as it happens. It's, well, at the moment, it's, if you go to the exhibition, there are some booklets to go with it. So you can take one of those, but I'm sure if you emailed, I could send you a copy of it. I've got a PDF of it, which there's a bit of overlap with some of the stories you heard today, but there's also some extra bits that to add to it.
Yeah, so you'll have my email address, or also the inquiries at Foundling Museum email address on the Zoom link. So either of those would be fine. I can pass that request on if you'd like to get the PDF. Thank you very much, Lizzy.
Okay.
Oh, and we've also got thank you very much, Lizzy, for a great talk.
Yay.
Do you have a rough sense how large London's music performing community might have been at the time of Lynley's concert?
Oh, okay. So I have made a database of musicians in the second half of the 18th century, and there are hundreds and hundreds of musicians in the database, but lots of them just kind of dip in and out. So quite a lot came from, well, not England. So lots came, like Handel, from Germany, and there were lots of the Storaces, they're Italian originally. And so there are lots of regular people like the Lynleys that we hear about all the time that come up, that pop up in all these different places around London and actually around the UK. But there are also a few people that kind of crop up and then disappear again. So I suppose it's sort of how you count somebody as being part of that network. I mean, there's like a core that would be much smaller than the hundreds and hundreds of people that are in my database. But there were also other people that kind of dipped in and out. So I don't know if that really helps. I suppose it's like today, that there are the sort of celebrities that you hear about all the time that sort of are here to stay, but there's always a one-hit wonder that, you know, was famous in 2009 that no one can remember anymore. And so they were still initially part of the network, but they've sort of been and gone a bit.
Oh, that's a great question. Thank you very much. Yeah. How expensive was it for people to attend a concert in the 1700s relative to sort of average income? Was it only rich people who would have gone?
Yeah, like very much, particularly because lots of concerts were subscription series. So you had to pay, it wasn't just one concert, you paid for the entire series, which might be, I don't know, like 10 concerts or something like that, which was really astronomically expensive. So really only the richest people in the country could afford to attend. There is somebody has written an article about, you know, statistically what percentage of people could actually afford it, and it's a very small number. I think this changed a bit over time, probably, as concerts became slightly more mainstream. But yeah, generally the audience members were the real, you know,
The elite?
nobility, the elite, exactly. Having said that, there were lots of instances of servants getting to attend the concerts because they would go with their, I don't know, mistress or master along to the concerts, and I guess they had their ticket paid for. I'm quite entirely sure, or the servants would reserve the seats for their boss, basically, at the opera. So there were lots of people that got in that we don't really know about, and they were sort of accessible in those ways, but they weren't the target audience, definitely.
I had a question actually, which is, would musicians have attended each other's concerts, or would it have been unaffordable?
I would imagine, I mean, this is mainly based on, I guess, my experience now is that they're so busy doing their own concerts that time, 7 o'clock, you know, on a weekday evening, they're probably in something else somewhere else, or they're dashing around to do other stuff. And I imagine that their experience of other musicians' performances probably is more likely to come from playing alongside them than from going to attend. But again, Thomas Arne, actually, the one that had an affair with Charlotte Brent, he was initially trained to be a lawyer, or he was trained in law because his father didn't want him to be a musician because it was a bit of a frowned upon profession. And he used to sneak into concerts to get experience of it, to sort of, I don't know, pick up on ideas. I'm not really sure. And the way he did that was, it links to what I said about servants before. He dressed up as a servant so that he could get in for free or without paying. So in that case, I guess there was some overlap, but I would imagine that generally they didn't go to each other's concerts.
Yeah. So we've got a question. Is there a certain area in the countryside where the musicians' country houses were? But I don't think it was the musicians you meant.
Oh no, sorry. So the rich and famous people that came to Parliament, so that's why they came into London, the noble men and women, they were the country houses. They had the country houses, so they came into London for the season and then went home again. But musicians used to travel around the country houses, sometimes, say, during the summer, to earn some extra money. As to the location, I mean, kind of, well, if you think about Jane Austen, there's a lot of mention in that. I mean, it's a slightly later period, but, you know, it's often like Hertfordshire, places like that, that are sort of, it's like now the commuter area, right? It's sort of close enough to London that you can get in fairly easily. It was still a bit of a faff because if you're going to go by horse, it's quite slow. But lots around there, but also further afield, that, yeah, up north and things as well.
So I guess if you're a kind of nobleman, you have estates that go with that. So your country house would be on your estate.
Exactly. Yeah.
Wherever you were duke of, or whatever it is. Yeah.
as you are, of course. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, fantastic. Okay. Well, I think that's the last of our questions from the audience. So that's it for today's talk, but we have another one coming up shortly to be advertised on the 27th of April. And that one is called Forgotten Sights of Victorian London. And the starting point for that is a new acquisition in the Foundling Museum collection, which is a handkerchief printed with a board game called London Sights. And one of the London sights is the Foundling Hospital. So that's a trip around London on the 27th of April. So I hope you'll join us for that. And that's with Adrian Seville, who's a collector and very knowledgeable about board games. So we're looking forward to that one. So thank you very much indeed. I will be sending out the link to the YouTube in due course. But thank you all very much for coming and for asking such interesting questions. And thanks again to Lizzy.